All right, here's the 6.1 homework. A long homework assignment, 16 problems. And maybe if you've watched all the videos in this section, you're not surprised that it's a longer homework assignment because there's really a lot of information in this section. The good news, if there is any, is that I think a lot of these will go fairly quickly for you. Like this first question, for example, you don't have to graph anything. All they're doing is they're giving you this equation and you're supposed to figure out the amplitude and the period. So it'd be nice if you could just look at this and tell what A, B, C, and D are equal to, and from that, figure out the amplitude and the period. I think it'll really only be A and B that you need to figure out those things. Refer to the formulas in the video, type those in, and you should be good. Kind of the same idea down here, except now, instead of just figuring out the amplitude and the period, you figure out the amplitude, the period, the midline, and the phase shift. Instead of calling it the phase shift, they call it the horizontal shift. And instead of it being positive or negative, you always put in the positive number here. And if it's negative, just say you're shifting to the left. I know that's a little bit weird, but if you're figuring out the phase shift is, I don't know, -10, then you would type in the number 10 here and you would put in left here. If you figure out the answer is phase shift is +5, type in a 5 here and put in right here. Sorry about the inconsistency in the verbiage that the homework uses and what I used in the videos. 3 is the same idea as 2, except they don't ask you anything about the midline this time. It's just the amplitude, the period, and the phase shift they want to know about. And here they don't say left or right. So if you figure out that the phase shift is -3, just type in -3. Whereas up here, you'd put in +3 and say it's to the left. Then we get into the graphing ones. The good news is the first two graphing ones will be really easy. F of x equals sine of x. All you got to do is choose which of these two you want. I think you could do it either way. The difference is this graphing tool, you're going to select a maximum and a minimum. This graphing tool, you're going to select a point on the midline and the maximum. And for this problem, really either one will work out fine. Select the tool that you want and then select 2 points and it'll figure out the rest for you. This is not the right answer, but hopefully you can figure out the right answer for the graph of sine of x and then do the same thing for cosine of x. 4 and 5 should be easy. 6, 7, 8, not so much. What you want to do here is come up with the graph of this function. So maybe you can look at this and tell that A is equal to 2 and B is equal to 1 and C is pi/4 and D is 0. And from that information, maybe you can figure out the amplitude, the midline, the period, and the phase shift. And when you have all that information and you know you're using the sine function, maybe you can grab either of these two graphing tools and select 2 points to come up with the graph of this function. My advice, although you don't have to follow this, is treat this like it were a test question and do this on a different piece of paper. And even though it only asks you for the graph, see if you can come up with amplitude, midline, period, and phase shift, and then sketch the graph like you were turning it in on a quiz. And then only then, after you get your final answer on a piece of paper, then come in and try to use this graphing tool. Of course, I won't know whether you do that or not. It's totally up to you. I think question 7 is a lot like question 6. They just give you a different function. Instead of 2 sine of x plus pi/4, it's -4 cosine of 1/2 x. So here A is -4 and B is 1/2, C is 0 and D is 0. And maybe you can come up with the graph of that function. And again, my advice to you would be to treat it like a quiz, but you do whatever you want to do. 8 is very similar. It's a transformation of the cosine graph. We have a value of A, a value of B, and a value of D here. So hopefully you can use those to come up with the graph. Then we get to 9. It's a lot like 8, except instead of being the cosine graph, it's the sine graph, and you're supposed to come up with that graph. I know that's a lot, but the good news is now you're done with graphing, and what you're going to do is work backwards. I'm worried this homework's too long, so I'm going to get rid of 10 and 11, so you won't see either of those when you go to do it. So what you see as 12 now will be number 10 on your homework. And what you're supposed to do here is come up with the equation of this graph. And to try to make your life a little bit easier, it's telling you that it goes through the point -13, -1, so this point right here, and +1, -1, so this point right here. So maybe use this as your starting point and this, informally speaking, is your ending point. And you could figure out the period and you could figure out the phase shift, amplitude and midline, and which of your functions you want to use and whether the orientation is normal or reversed. Come up with your equation and type it in right here. And I hope you don't hate doing that because you do the exact same thing in 13, except they give you a different graph. Instead of going through these points, it tells you that it goes through -9, 0, and 1, 0. So what you're supposed to do is use this as your starting point and this is your ending point. Oh man, that was brutal. Well, bad news because you got to do it again down here for 14. So 14 and 15, a couple things. First, I'm going to rewrite these problems so that it says A cosine of bx plus c in the parentheses and then plus d. I want these letters to match up with the letters that I used in the videos. So this will look a little bit different by the time you see it. Same down here. This will say A sine of bx plus c plus d. They're telling you to model this with the cosine function, but they don't tell you the phase shift. So it's up to you to choose your starting point. You could start over here. It appears that it goes through the point -14, 6 and use that as your starting point. And then one full revolution would take you over here. Or you could start down here at -7, -2, and use this as one full revolution. You could start at a maximum or a minimum, it doesn't matter, because you're using the cosine graph to model this thing. If you start out at a maximum, note that you'll have the normal orientation, whereas if you start at the minimum, you'll have the opposite orientation, so be really careful when you calculate A. Same idea with this graph, except now we're modeling it in terms of sine, and the sine graph always starts on the midline. So when you're looking for your starting point, don't look for the values of the maxima or the minima. Instead, look for the x value when this graph is on its midline. The midline is just the x-axis here, so one possible starting point would be at -14, 0, where my pointer is. You could also start at -7, 0, and think about this as one full revolution. Just be careful, based on your starting point, make sure that you have the right orientation. That's all for the required homework. There's one more homework question that, I don't know, at this point you might be burnt out on this stuff and not even want to do it. But if you want to do question 16, it's the same idea. You're just supposed to come up with the equation of a function that would go through these points. And you don't have the graph, so it's kind of hard, and they pick some sort of weird points. But maybe if you sketch a graph and you put dots at these points, you'd be able to tell what some maxima and some minima are equal to, what the midline is, and then you could figure out a phase shift and whether you want to use sine or cosine. I don't know. 16, do it if you want to do it, but certainly feel free to skip it if you don't feel like doing that one. A challenging homework assignment for sure. If you can get through this, you should be really proud of yourself. This is one of the harder things we'll be doing in this class.